Hello, Victor Oliver. Back, not on the beach today, but Palace of Versailles. Talking about the US election 2020. On October the 29th, I forecast that Biden would win. I wasn't alone. A number of astrologers forecast his victory. And those astrologers, I'm sure, will be talking about their techniques and so forth. My approach is quite straightforward. I use 4 techniques for the purposes of elections. I look at transits, progressions, directions, and solar returns. And what I'm going to do in this video is to go through the 4 techniques very briefly. I mean, I'm not looking for micro details. I don't do micro details. One's really looking for major aspects to see what the indicators are. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to share the screen. Hopefully it all goes according to plan, and we can look at some charts. Here we are. Yeah. So this is the point where I should put some music, but let's save ourselves the bells and whistles. So just to familiarize ourselves with Donald Trump's birth chart, as we all know, he's born under a lunar eclipse next to Uranus, which gives him that rather extraordinary personality he has. Mars on the rising point gives him the aggression and the pride. There's more to it than this, but it's just to re-familiarize ourselves with his chart. Let's look at the transits for 3rd of November. I'll just bring my image down. And so this is his birth chart. The inner wheel is the birth chart. The outer wheel are the transits of the 3rd of November for the end of the day, end of polls. No point doing starter polls when about 100 million people already voted. So the best time is at the end of the day, I think, for Washington. In fact, for this, I used Donald Trump's transits chart, in actual fact, for Jamaica, New York. I suppose the most interesting thing about this day is the fact that he was having a nodal return. He's still actually at a nodal return. It was absolutely precise, north node on north node. At first, I wondered whether this was a sign of victory, but when I looked at the history of his nodal returns, I couldn't really establish a positive or a negative pattern with them. So I decided that it could be a strong indication of a change in direction, because it's quite an important thing, the nodal return. But the thing that I'm looking at some notes too, he had the moon coming into his 10th house, which also could be slightly misleading. It certainly explains how he's not actually lost his fan base, so to speak. If anything, I think he's added millions of votes to his, I'm going to say defeat. It sounds an odd thing to put like that, but he actually has more votes than he did in 2016. And that too could be an indication of potential victory in itself, but not sufficiently. But the moon was passing over his birth planets here in Gemini, and certainly that would account for the extraordinary support that he got, even though he lost the election. What wasn't going in his favor are some long-term aspects. Saturn is opposite Venus, which normally indicates feeling isolated. It's quite a challenging aspect there, but even more challenging is that Pluto, this is transiting Pluto, remember, is opposing his Saturn. Now, Saturn in this instance really is about one's power, one's authority. And Pluto, of course, has this awful tendency to disrupt, because it wants to change things. That's essentially what it's about. What's interesting is that on the day, Pluto's back to where the Saturn-Pluto conjunction took place at the time in early January of this year, which we most associate, I think it was the 12th of January, which we most associate with the coronavirus, would you believe? But certainly it's a very potent Pluto, this, of the day. And I didn't like the look of it opposing his Saturn, because in another sense, Saturn also is the planet of authority or government and so forth. He is the president. And with Pluto opposing, I really thought that that was quite a negative association. It's not definitively a sign of defeat, but it's not the sort of aspect you want to see when you're seeking re-election. And also to be said that the Sun that day was squaring and separating square to his Pluto. So here again, the Sun representing his identity. It's not the sort of aspect you want to see if you're seeking a victory in an election. I thought that that was perhaps a frustration of power. That's how I read it. Let's have a look at his progressions. The progressions are quite interesting. Notice, first of all, that progressed Sun is moving away from the rising point, bearing in mind that this is a slow-moving Sun. When he won the 2016 election, the Sun was actually on the ascendant point. Now it's moving away, and I interpret that to indicate a waning power. It's moving into Virgo. It's moved into Virgo as well. So that I also took that to be a negative. But even more interesting, look here. Remember, these are progressions. Now, normally we don't look at progressed Uranus because it moves so slowly. But I have found in my practice that do look at the progressed outers, especially if they are forming quite acute aspects. And here we find an interesting swap going on. Progressed Uranus is now sitting between Sun and natal North Node, in effect, conjunct both, whereas the progressed North Node is sitting on top of the birth Uranus. It's like a swap of the point and the planet. And I took that to be a very strong indication of a change. The North Node, just to remind ourselves, and in brief, is the destiny point. It's also the life challenge point, or the life direction point. And Uranus, of course, as we know, is the indicator of sudden change, shocking change. And of course, Trump wasn't expecting to be defeated. I don't think he did anyway. He may have had an intimation that things weren't going well. But certainly I felt that this was a very strong indication of a change in his destiny, so to speak. And for that moment, actually, I think I'll move on to the directions, because there's another indication with Uranus. Notice how Uranus now, this is the directed Uranus, is sitting exactly on his rising point. And I do feel that this was a very, very strong indication of change in his life. It's not the sort of planet you want sitting on your rising point if you're seeking more of the same, such as a re-election. Notice also that directed North Node is moved into early Virgo, another sign of change. The Sun, of course, is where the progressed Sun is. It's the same point. But this also is a very strong indication of change in the life. I don't think there are other directions I particularly want to be bothered with. There are other things going on in this chart, but I don't want to go into micro detail. This is Trump's solar return, and it's not the happiest of solar returns, to be honest with you. It's got Cancer rising, so Moon is the chart ruler. And the Moon is where you don't really want it to be, in the 8th house, which we tend to associate with negatives. The other thing I don't like about, from his point of view, is the fact that Neptune and Mars are exactly conjunct in the 8th house. And this is an enfeebling aspect. And Mars normally likes being in the 8th house, but with Neptune bang on the same point in the 21st degree of Pisces, this is, it lessens the power of Mars when it wants to be directional and dynamic. It wants to go in another direction, and Pisces will tend to diffuse energies, and you don't know in what direction they're going to go next. And so close to the Moon, I don't see that. I didn't see that as a very good sign. And I thought that come the election, this particular aspect was probably going to be fairly key. So I reached the conclusion that his 4 charts weren't very promising. Let's have a look at Joe Biden's chart. Very, very scorpionic, as we can see. He's got this stellium in the 12th house, Scorpio. Whether he's Sagittarius rising or not, I don't know about that. He doesn't strike me as very Sagittarius rising, but I'm not going to argue the toss on that one. We go with the birth data that we supplied. As the birth details are up here, Scranton, Pennsylvania. So let's have a look at his transits for the same time. Remember, the inner wheel is the birth chart, and the outer wheel are the transits for the same time, 3rd of November, end of day. And I've not relocated. This is for Scranton, Pennsylvania. Now, what's interesting about this chart immediately, bearing in mind that he's got this stellium, the sun for that moment is exactly conjunct his Mars, which co-rules the sign. This is a very empowering aspect. It's not definitive of victory, but it certainly helps because it gives him a real push. And because you've got a stellium here, although it's very wide, it nonetheless draws on all the energies, Mercury, Sun, Venus, into this. So that's a very powerful indicator. It certainly gives him a plus. And also his ascendant point is separating from conjunction to Jupiter. And I think that's what I want to say about, there are, as I say, there are other things going on here, but we must move on. As for his secondary progressions, I'm going to just look at my notes. Oh yes, there's only one aspect here that interests me, and that's progressed midheaven. Bearing in mind that's a very slow moving point, is exactly opposite his birth Saturn. Now, you might think an opposition is a negative, not necessarily. In this instance, it's more indicative of a new cycle of life. Both have to do with power. The midheaven is to do with direction, in Sagittarius, opposite Saturn, his Saturn in Gemini. So I interpreted that as the potential new cycle of authority, power. Remember, Saturn is the planet of leadership and authority. This is his solar arc directions. Interestingly, we've got Saturn again on the anaretic degree in Leo, coming towards the end of its Leo time, conjoining the North Node. And so what we've got here in the directions is an association of power authority at the top of the chart on his destiny point, another potential marker. And it's interesting that it also triggers the chironic energy too. So you can almost say that there's such a the wounded healer about Biden, if that indeed proves to be the case. It's also worth noting that his directed North Node is in the middle of his Scorpio stellium. So the destiny point is definitely indicating something going on with his birth energies, okay? Now, I did 2 solar returns for Joe Biden, mainly because his birthday falls on 19th, the 20th of November, actually. Solar return actually goes into the 19th. What's interesting about this particular solar return, the birthday chart, is that he's got a kite formation. The kite formation is very fortunate, very fortuitous. It indicates that a lot of energies are pulling together. And in this instance, the apex of 2 planets widely conjunct, very widely conjunct actually, Mars and Mercury. And it's the Mars that interests me the most because as it's the co-ruler of his birth sign. And Uranus in this instance is actually acting in his favor. It gives him that surprise push, albeit from the 8th. But I took that to be a very good indication. Just going to remind myself if there's anything else I want to say about that. Also, do note that his midheaven in his solar return is in early Gemini. It's just 5 seconds in. A fairly good indication that he's starting a new cycle. It kind of plays very well with what we saw in his solar arc directions chart. And I then did a solar return for 2020. Now, interestingly, he's got Scorpio rising, which plays very well with his Scorpio stellium in his birth chart, okay? And it's worth also noting that the sun is sextile his planets in Capricorn for that particular year. And he's got the moon there, which in mundane astrology is very useful for representing the people, popularity, that sort of thing. Just remind myself if there's anything else that I want to say. It is actually quite a stormy chart. You've got Mars widely square, the Capricorn planets. You've got Uranus on close to the descendant point. So I think his presidency, although I've not done the presidential chart yet, but as an indication of his year ahead, I think that there are going to be quite a few storm clouds. I don't know whether that might be the sort of Trump hangover, but as an indication for him as a solar return for empowerment, I love the Sun sextile the Capricorn planets. So I'll bring to an end the share. I hope that you found that interesting. If you want to know more about my astrology, do visit me at victoroliver.co.uk, and that's 2 L's in Oliver. And you'll see I map out my approach to astrology, and also I have a shop where you can purchase various different services. Okay, I won't go on about that, but thank you very much for joining me, and let's hope that it's all going to be great. But congratulations to the United States on the presidential outcome, and let us all hope that Donald Trump can accept with good grace this result, and that he, I'm sure, will find another life epoch in which to dominate matters. So thank you again for joining me today, and I'll talk again soon. Bye-bye.